Have you ever wondered how one small decision could change everything? Picture this, a freezing night in Manhattan, a stranger at a bus stop, and a worn-out jacket that holds more meaning than anyone could imagine. What happens next will take you on a journey of resilience, love, and the power of kindness. But here's the twist, it all starts with just one selfless act. Don't miss a moment of this incredible story. Hit that subscribe button and join our community to explore more tales that inspire and challenge your perspective. And we want to hear from you. What would you have done in their shoes? Share your thoughts in the comments below. Let's start a conversation. The wind howled through the streets of Manhattan, cutting like a knife through the heavy layers of clothing that Jason Carter had managed to scavenge over the past few months. He stood at a bus stop on the corner of 42nd and Broadway, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his worn olive jacket, the only possession he hadn't sold or lost in the year since everything fell apart. Snowflakes swirled around him, sticking to his scruffy beard and dampening the thin fabric of his jeans. It was one of those nights where even the city seemed to shiver, its neon lights reflecting off icy puddles as if reluctant to face the cold. Jason shifted his weight from foot to foot, trying to keep warm. His breath came out in visible puffs, disappearing into the frosty air almost instantly. People hurried past him without so much as a glance, some clutching steaming cups of coffee, others wrapped tightly in designer coats. He felt invisible, just another shadow blending into the urban landscape. But tonight, something, or someone, caught his attention. A young woman approached the bus stop, her arms crossed tightly over her chest. She wore no coat, just a flimsy sweater that did little to shield her from the biting wind. Her dark hair whipped across her face, and she stamped her feet nervously, clearly trying to stay warm. Jason noticed her trembling lips and the way her teeth chattered audibly despite her attempts to remain composed. Something about her struck him, not pity, exactly, but recognition. He knew what it meant to be desperate, to feel the world closing in while everyone else walked by oblivious. For a moment, he hesitated. This jacket wasn't much, it was old, patched up more times than he could count, and smelled faintly of smoke and sweat, but it was all he had left. Allowing himself a deep sigh, Jason stepped forward. "Hey," he said, his voice rough from disuse. When she looked up, startled, he gestured toward his jacket. "Here. Take this." Her eyes widened in disbelief. "What?" "No, I can't," she stammered, shaking her head emphatically. "It's okay," he interrupted gently, already sliding the jacket off his shoulders. "I've already lost everything, but I still have this." His words hung there between them, heavy with meaning. They weren't just talking about a piece of clothing anymore, they were acknowledging something deeper, something unspoken. Loss. Struggle. Survival. Before she could protest further, he draped the jacket over her shoulders. She pulled it close instinctively, enveloping herself in its warmth, and perhaps, unknowingly, in the weight of his sacrifice. For a moment, she simply stared at him, her brown eyes brimming with emotion. Finally, she whispered, "Thank you." Her voice cracked slightly, betraying gratitude too profound for mere words. Just then, the distant rumble of an approaching bus broke the spell. She glanced down the street, then back at him, searching his face as though memorizing every detail. I don't know what to say," she admitted softly. "You don't have to say anything," Jason replied with a small shrug, forcing a smile that didn't quite reach his tired eyes. "Just take care of yourself." With that, she turned and boarded the bus, leaving him standing alone once again. As the vehicle pulled away, Jason watched her silhouette disappear behind fogged-up windows. A strange mix of emptiness and relief washed over him. Empty because he'd given away his last defense against the cold. Relieved because, for the first time in months, he'd done something truly selfless. But the story didn't end there. Hours later, as Elena sat huddled in the warmth of her tiny apartment, she reached into the pocket of the borrowed jacket to find a folded piece of paper. Curious, she unfolded it carefully, revealing a child's drawing, a stick figure holding hands with a taller stick figure beneath a bright yellow sun. Scrawled across the top in messy block letters were the words, "I love you, Daddy, Sammy." Elena froze, her heart clenching unexpectedly. She traced the lines of the drawing with her fingertips, imagining the life this man must have left behind. Who was Sammy? What had happened to tear Jason away from his family? And why had fate brought them together on the coldest night of the year? As she stared at the drawing, her resolve hardened. She wouldn't let this act of kindness go unnoticed. Somehow, someway, she would find him again. The memory hit him like a freight train, unbidden but vivid. Jason sat hunched in the driver's seat of his rusted-out van, parked under the shadow of an abandoned warehouse on the outskirts of Queens. Outside, snow blanketed the ground, muffling the distant hum of traffic. Inside, it was just him and the ghosts of his past, ghosts that refused to stay silent. Once upon a time, Jason hadn't been this man. He had been someone else entirely. Someone with a home, a family, a purpose. Back then, he'd worked as an engineer at a mid-sized tech firm in Jersey City. His days were filled with blueprints and algorithms, late nights spent debugging code, and early mornings waking up to the smell of coffee brewing in the kitchen. Anna, his wife, would kiss him goodbye before heading off to her nursing shift, leaving their young son Sammy to crawl into bed beside him, demanding pancakes for breakfast. Sammy. Even now, the name brought both comfort and pain. At 6 years old, Sammy had been the light of Jason's life, a curious, bright-eyed boy who loved dinosaurs, Legos, and building forts out of sofa cushions. Jason could still hear his laughter echoing through the halls of their small suburban house, see the way his face lit up whenever Jason came home from work. Those moments felt impossibly far away now, like scenes from a movie he'd watched once and couldn't quite remember. But life has a way of unraveling even the strongest threads. It started with Anna's diagnosis, stage 4 cancer. The doctors gave them hope at first, promising treatments and experimental therapies. But hope is expensive, and so is medicine. Medical bills piled up faster than Jason could pay them, draining their savings and forcing them to sell nearly everything they owned. For 2 years, they fought together, clinging to each other and to Sammy. Then one day, Anna didn't wake up. Just like that, she was gone. Jason tried to keep going, for Sammy's sake, if nothing else. But grief is heavy, and when it mixes with debt and exhaustion, it becomes unbearable. Within months, he lost his job. His performance slipped, deadlines passed unnoticed. One afternoon, his boss called him into the office and handed him a severance package along with a handshake that felt more like a dismissal. Without income, rent payments stopped coming, and soon after, so did their apartment. Friends offered temporary help, but pride, or maybe shame, kept Jason from accepting much. Eventually, even the friends stopped calling. And then came the hardest blow of all, losing custody of Sammy. Social services stepped in when they realized Jason couldn't provide a stable environment. They said it was, in the child's best interest. He wanted to argue, to scream that he was trying, that he loved his son more than anything in the world. But what could he say? He didn't have a roof over his head, let alone food on the table. So, he signed the papers, watching helplessly as Sammy was taken away to live with Anna's sister in Chicago. That was 3 years ago. Since then, Jason had lived out of his van, moving from parking lot to parking lot, always careful not to draw attention. During the day, he visited public libraries, teaching himself new programming languages through free online courses. He applied for jobs relentlessly, tailoring resumes and practicing answers to potential interview questions. But no matter how hard he tried, the callbacks never came. Employers saw his gap in employment, his lack of references, and dismissed him without a second thought. Still, there were rituals he clung to, small acts of defiance against the chaos of his life. Every few weeks, he walked to a nearby barbershop and paid $5 for a haircut. Not because he cared about appearances, he barely recognized himself in the mirror anymore, but because of Sammy. Somewhere deep inside, Jason held on to the belief that someday, somehow, he'd get his son back. And when that day came, he wanted Sammy to see a father worth believing in. "I still cut my hair," he muttered aloud to the empty van, running a hand over his neatly trimmed scalp. "Because my son needs to believe I'll come back." His routine was predictable, almost mechanical. Wake up before dawn to avoid detection. Shower at the YMCA if he had enough change for a membership fee that week. Spend hours at the library, refreshing job boards and tweaking his LinkedIn profile. In the evenings, he scavenged meals from soup kitchens or dumpster dived behind grocery stores. Occasionally, he picked up odd jobs, moving furniture, cleaning gutters, anything that put a few dollars in his pocket. Yet despite the monotony, there was a strange kind of peace in knowing exactly what each day would bring. Predictability was its own form of stability. Tonight, though, something was different. As Jason stared out the cracked windshield of his van, his mind kept drifting back to the woman at the bus stop, the one who'd accepted his jacket without hesitation. Elena. That was her name, wasn't it? She hadn't asked for help, hadn't pitied him or looked down on him. Instead, she'd simply said thank you, 2 words that carried more weight than she probably realized. For the first time in years, Jason allowed himself to wonder if maybe, just maybe, his luck was beginning to change. Maybe giving away that jacket hadn't been a mistake. Maybe it had been the start of something bigger. Something better. The elevator doors slid open with a soft chime, revealing the sleek, minimalist interior of Elena's penthouse. She stepped inside, her heels clicking against the polished marble floor. The apartment was everything you'd expect from someone who had made it big, floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of Manhattan's glittering skyline, modern furniture arranged with surgical precision, and artwork that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. It was beautiful, yes, but also eerily silent. No music played, no laughter echoed through the halls. Just the faint hum of the city far below. Elena shrugged off Jason's jacket as she walked into the living room, draping it over the back of a leather couch. For a moment, she stood there staring at it, her fingers absently tracing the worn fabric. There was something haunting about its simplicity, a stark contrast to the luxury surrounding her. She hesitated, then reached into the pocket, pulling out the folded piece of paper she'd discovered earlier. Unfolding it carefully, she held it up to the light, reading the words again, "I love you, Daddy, Sammy." Her breath hitched, and suddenly the weight of the gesture hit her like a tidal wave. This wasn't just a random act of kindness, this was a man giving away his last shred of dignity, his last connection to a life he'd lost. Her knees buckled, and she sank onto the couch, clutching the drawing to her chest. Tears spilled down her cheeks without warning, hot and uncontrollable. She felt exposed, raw, as if the pain behind those simple words had seeped into her own soul. Memories flooded back, unbidden and unwelcome. Memories she'd buried long ago, locked away in some dark corner of her mind where they couldn't hurt her anymore. But tonight, they came rushing forward, vivid and unrelenting. She was 8 years old again, standing on a street corner in Brooklyn, shivering beneath a threadbare hoodie. Winter had come early that year, and the wind cut through her thin clothes like razor blades. Her foster parents, or rather, the couple who were supposed to be her foster parents, had kicked her out after another argument. They didn't want her anyway, not really. She was too much trouble, too angry, too broken. So she wandered the streets alone, trying to stay warm, trying not to cry. And then, out of nowhere, he appeared. A stranger. His name was Thomas, though she wouldn't learn that until later. He wore a heavy wool coat, the kind that looked expensive even to an 8-year-old's untrained eye. When he saw her huddled against the wall, tears streaming down her face, he stopped. Without saying a word, he took off his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. "You'll be okay," he said softly, kneeling down to meet her gaze. His voice was gentle, steady, like an anchor in the storm raging inside her. She never saw him again after that night. Social services eventually picked her up and placed her with a new family, one that actually cared. But Thomas's coat stayed with her for years, patched and repaired until it barely resembled the original. More importantly, his kindness stayed with her too, a quiet reminder that even in the darkest moments, humanity could shine through. Back in the present, Elena wiped her tears with the sleeve of her sweater, her resolve hardening. That man, the one at the bus stop, deserved more than the cold indifference of the world. He deserved a second chance, just like she'd been given all those years ago. And she was going to make sure he got it. Reaching for her phone, she scrolled through her contacts until she found the number she needed. Eric, her assistant, answered on the first ring. Elena? Everything okay? I need you to find someone, she said, her voice firm despite the lingering tremor in her chest. A man named Jason Carter. Start with recent addresses, employment records, anything you can dig up. I don't care how long it takes, I want to know everything. There was a pause on the other end of the line. Okay, do you have any details to go on? He's homeless, Elena replied bluntly. Last seen near 42nd and Broadway. Wears an olive jacket, that's gone now, and has a son named Sammy. Oh, and he used to work as an engineer. Eric exhaled sharply. That's not much to work with. It's enough, Elena snapped, her tone leaving no room for argument. Just do it, Eric. Yes, ma'am, he replied quickly. I'll get started right away. Hanging up, Elena leaned back against the couch, her eyes drifting to the city lights outside. Somewhere out there, Jason Carter was fighting to survive, clinging to fragments of a life he'd lost. But not anymore. Not if she had anything to say about it. The next morning, Elena sat in her office, staring at the sleek monitor on her desk. Her penthouse apartment had been transformed into a makeshift command center, papers scattered across the table, coffee cups abandoned half full, and Eric typing furiously on his laptop beside her. Rachel, Elena's assistant, was stationed nearby, scrolling through pages of public records on her tablet. The air buzzed with quiet urgency, a tension that seemed to tighten with every passing minute. Anything yet? Elena asked sharply, breaking the silence. She hadn't slept much the previous night, her mind racing with images of Jason Carter, the man who had given away his last possession without hesitation. She couldn't shake the feeling that time was slipping away, that if they didn't act quickly, he might disappear entirely. Eric glanced up from his screen, adjusting his glasses. We're narrowing it down, he said cautiously. I've been tracking traffic camera footage near 42nd and Broadway. It's slow going, he moves around a lot, but I think I caught a glimpse of him last night. He was heading toward Queens. Elena leaned forward, her fingers tapping impatiently against the desk. Queens? Any specific location? Rachel chimed in before Eric could respond. Actually, she held up her tablet triumphantly. I found something. His name is Jason Carter. Used to work as an engineer for a tech firm in Jersey City. Lost his job about 3 years ago. No permanent address now, but there are traces of activity, a few library visits, some coding course enrollments under his name. Elena's eyes narrowed. What else? Rachel hesitated, glancing at the notes on her screen. There's more. Recent internet searches linked to his email account. She paused dramatically. One of them was, how to get custody back. The room fell silent. Elena felt a pang of recognition, not just sympathy, but understanding. This wasn't just a man struggling to survive, this was a father desperate to reclaim what mattered most to him. Her voice softened slightly as she spoke. Does he have family? A son? Rachel nodded. Yes. According to old records, he has a 6-year-old son named Sammy. Custody transferred to the mother's sister after, well, after the mother passed away. Elena closed her eyes briefly, piecing together the fragments of Jason's life. Cancer. Loss. Desperation. It all fit too perfectly, like shards of glass forming a fractured mirror. And suddenly, the weight of the drawing in her pocket, the one signed by Sammy, felt heavier than ever. "Where is he now?" she demanded, opening her eyes again. Eric tapped a few keys, pulling up a grainy image on his laptop. "This is from earlier today," he explained, turning the screen toward Elena. "Traffic cam near an industrial area in Queens. Looks like he's sleeping in a van." Elena studied the photo intently. The vehicle was old and rusted, parked beneath the shadow of a crumbling warehouse. Snow covered its hood and roof, blending it into the bleak surroundings. But there was no mistaking the figure slumped behind the wheel, his silhouette faintly visible through the cracked windshield. Her jaw tightened. "That's him. What's the plan?" Eric asked, looking between Elena and Rachel. Elena stood abruptly, grabbing her coat from the back of her chair. "I want to see him myself." Rachel raised an eyebrow. "You mean, go there? Alone?" "No," Elena replied firmly. "You're both coming with me. We need answers, and we need to do this carefully. Whatever happens, we can't scare him off." 20 minutes later, they were in Elena's black SUV, weaving through the icy streets of Queens. The GPS guided them toward the industrial zone, where rows of dilapidated warehouses loomed like skeletons against the gray sky. As they approached the address Eric had pinpointed, Elena slowed the car, scanning the area for the familiar shape of the van. "There!" Rachel exclaimed, pointing ahead. Sure enough, the rusted-out vehicle was still there, partially hidden behind a stack of pallets. Its windows were fogged over, and fresh snow dusted its exterior. Elena parked a short distance away, cutting the engine. For a moment, none of them moved, the weight of the situation settling over them like a heavy blanket. Finally, Elena broke the silence. "Stay here," she instructed Eric and Rachel. "If anything goes wrong, call for backup. Got it?" They nodded reluctantly, though their expressions betrayed their unease. Elena didn't blame them, this wasn't exactly protocol. But something inside her refused to wait, to delegate. This was personal now. Taking a deep breath, she stepped out of the car and approached the van cautiously. Each step crunched softly in the snow, the sound muffled by the oppressive quiet of the neighborhood. When she reached the driver's side window, she knocked gently, her heart pounding in her chest. For a long moment, there was no response. Then, slowly, the figure inside stirred. The window rolled down partway, revealing a tired, bearded face. Jason blinked up at her, confusion etched across his features. "Can I help you?" he asked groggily, his voice rough with sleep. Elena hesitated, gripping the edge of the window frame. "Jason Carter?" she asked, her tone softer than she intended. He frowned, suspicion flickering in his eyes. "Who's asking?" She pulled the worn olive jacket from her arm and held it out to him. "It's me. From the bus stop. You gave me this." Recognition dawned on his face, followed by a mix of emotions, surprise, embarrassment, maybe even a hint of pride. "Oh," he said simply, running a hand through his unkempt hair. "Right. How'd you find me?" "That's a long story," Elena admitted, her gaze steady. "But I think we should talk. There's something you need to know." Jason stared at her, his eyes narrowing as if trying to decipher whether she was friend or foe. The cold air swirled around them, biting at their skin, but neither seemed to notice. Elena stood there, holding out the olive jacket like a peace offering, while Jason sat slumped in the driver's seat of his van, looking every bit the picture of a man who had nothing left to lose. "You already took the coat," he said finally, his voice low and gravelly. There was an edge to it, defensive, wary. "What more do you want?" Elena hesitated, gripping the jacket tighter. She hadn't planned this moment exactly, how could she? How do you prepare to confront someone whose life feels like a mirror reflecting your own pain? But she knew one thing for certain, she couldn't turn away now. Not after everything she'd learned about him. I want to understand, she said simply, her tone softening. Why did you give it to me? He blinked at her, clearly caught off guard by the question. For a moment, he just looked at her, searching her face as if trying to gauge whether she was mocking him. Then, slowly, he leaned back against the seat, exhaling a long breath that fogged up the inside of the window. That coat, he began, his voice quieter now, tinged with something between sadness and resolve. It was all I had left. Literally. Everything else, the house, the job, my family, it's gone. But here's the thing, just because it was all I had didn't mean I couldn't give it away. Elena tilted her head slightly, studying him. His words carried a weight far beyond their simplicity. They spoke of loss, yes, but also of resilience, a stubborn refusal to let despair define him completely. Why me? She pressed gently. You didn't even know me. Jason shrugged, his shoulders rising and falling beneath the thin layers of clothing he wore. Maybe it was because you reminded me of someone. Or maybe. I don't know. Maybe I saw myself in you. Standing there shaking, trying to hold it together when the world feels like it's falling apart. He paused, glancing down at his hands. I've been where you were. And I guess I just wanted to remind you that not everyone turns their backs. Elena felt a lump rise in her throat. His honesty was disarming, raw in a way that made her chest ache. She thought about Thomas, the stranger who had given her his coat all those years ago, and how much that single act of kindness had meant to her. Had Jason known what he was doing when he handed over his jacket? Did he realize the ripple effect such a gesture could have? I found something in the pocket, she said after a beat, pulling the folded drawing from her coat. She held it up so he could see it. This. Jason's expression shifted instantly, softening as his eyes landed on the familiar scrawl. Sammy, he murmured, almost to himself. A faint smile tugged at the corners of his mouth, though it was tinged with sorrow. He drew that for me before, well, before things fell apart. He loves you, Elena said softly. That much is clear. Jason nodded, swallowing hard. Yeah. He does. And I love him too. Enough to keep fighting, even when it feels pointless. There was a long pause, the kind that stretches between two people who are beginning to recognize each other, not just as strangers, but as fellow travelers on a difficult road. Finally, Elena reached into her pocket and pulled out a sleek black business card. She extended it toward him, her hand steady despite the storm of emotions swirling inside her. If you ever want help, she said firmly, real help, I can offer that. No strings attached. Jason eyed the card warily, his brow furrowing. Help? What kind of help? The kind that gets you back on your feet, she replied without hesitation. Job leads, legal advice, housing assistance. Whatever you need. I'm not promising miracles, but I can start making calls today if you're willing. For a moment, he just stared at the card, as if weighing its potential value against the risks of hope. Hope was dangerous, it came with expectations, with the possibility of failure. Yet there was something in Elena's gaze, steady, determined, that made him hesitate. Why are you doing this? He asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. You don't owe me anything. Elena smiled faintly, a mixture of sadness and resolve flickering across her face. Let's just say I know what it's like to be given a second chance. And I think it's time someone gave you one too. With that, she stepped back, leaving the business card resting on the dashboard of the van. She didn't wait for a response, didn't push him to make a decision right then and there. Instead, she turned and walked back toward the SUV, her footsteps crunching softly in the snow. As she slid into the driver's seat, Eric and Rachel immediately leaned forward, their expressions anxious. "Well?" Rachel whispered urgently. Elena glanced back at the van one last time. Jason was still sitting there, staring at the business card like it might vanish if he looked away. "He'll call," she said quietly, her voice filled with quiet certainty. "When he's ready." The next morning, Jason trudged through the icy streets of Manhattan with a heavy heart. His destination was the Child Protective Services office on 8th Avenue, a place he'd come to dread. Each visit felt like another nail in the coffin of his hopes, another reminder of how far he'd fallen. Yet he kept coming back, clinging to the belief that someday, somehow, he'd prove himself worthy of being a father again. Inside the sterile waiting room, Jason sat stiffly on a plastic chair, clutching a folder filled with documents he'd painstakingly gathered over the past few months. Pay stubs from odd jobs, certificates from free coding courses, even letters of recommendation from librarians who had seen him quietly working at their computers day after day. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. When his name was called, he stood and followed the caseworker into her cramped office. The conversation was brief and brutally direct. "Mr. Carter," she said, folding her hands on the desk, "I understand your desire to reconnect with your son. But until you can provide stable housing and consistent income, we simply cannot approve visitation rights." Jason nodded numbly, though each word felt like a punch to the gut. He'd known this was coming, it always did, but hearing it aloud never got easier. "What about supervised visits?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "Just once. Let me see him, even if it's only for an hour." "I'm sorry," she replied, shaking her head. "The foster family has expressed concerns about disrupting Sammy's routine. They believe it's in his best interest to maintain stability." Stability. That word again. Jason clenched his fists beneath the table, biting back the anger bubbling inside him. Stability meant nothing if it came at the cost of love, if it meant keeping a child from the parent who would give anything to make him happy. Later that afternoon, as Jason wandered aimlessly through the city, he found himself drawn to a nearby elementary school. Children spilled out onto the playground during recess, laughing and shouting as they chased each other across the snow-dusted field. And then he saw him. Sammy. His son was smaller than he remembered, bundled up in a bright red coat that dwarfed his tiny frame. His cheeks were rosy from the cold, and his dark hair stuck out beneath his woolen hat. For a moment, Jason froze, unable to move or breathe. All the pain, all the frustration melted away, leaving only awe and longing. Sammy hadn't noticed him, he was too busy building a snowman with a group of classmates. Jason watched from behind a chain-link fence, memorizing every detail, the way Sammy tilted his head when he concentrated, the way his laughter rang out like music. Tears welled in Jason's eyes, blurring his vision, but he didn't care. This was enough, for now. Just knowing that Sammy was safe, happy, alive. That night, back in the van, Jason pulled out a notebook and began writing a letter. The words poured out of him like a dam breaking, raw and unfiltered. "Dear Sammy. I don't know if you'll ever read this, but I need you to know something. Every decision I've made these past few years, all the sacrifices, all the struggles, they've been for you. I may not be there to tuck you in at night or teach you how to ride a bike, but please believe me when I say I think about you every single day. You're my reason to keep fighting. My reason to hope, *. He signed it with trembling hands, "Love, Daddy." But when he finished, reality hit hard. He had no address to send it to. No way to reach the boy who meant everything to him. Folding the letter carefully, he tucked it into the glove compartment, vowing to hold onto it until the day came when he could deliver it himself. Meanwhile, Elena was piecing together her own puzzle. After returning from Queens, she'd spent hours combing through corporate records, searching for any connection between Sammy's foster family and her company. What she discovered shocked her. Sammy's aunt, Anna's sister, was married to one of her vice presidents, Richard Hargrove. The coincidence was almost too perfect. Determined to act, Elena arranged a private meeting with Richard the following day. She cornered him in the executive lounge, where floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the bustling city below. He looked surprised to see her, setting down his coffee cup as she approached. "Richard," she began without preamble, "I need to talk to you about something important. Personal." His brow furrowed, curiosity piqued. "Of course, Elena. What is it?" "It's about your wife's nephew," she said, watching his expression closely. "Sammy." Richard stiffened, clearly caught off guard. "What about him?" Elena took a deep breath, choosing her words carefully. "Do you know what his father has been doing? Where he's been living?" Richard shook his head slowly. "We haven't had contact with Jason since custody was transferred." "Why?" She hesitated, then leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a whisper. "Because Jason Carter stood in the snow for hours, wearing nothing but a thin jacket, just so he could give it to a stranger. Because he writes letters to his son that he can't send. Because he hasn't given up, not completely. And Sammy deserves to know that his father loves him enough to fight for him, even when the odds are stacked against him." Richard stared at her, visibly moved by her words. Finally, he sighed deeply. "What do you propose we do?" Elena smiled faintly, a spark of determination lighting her eyes. "Let's bring them together. Even if it's just for a moment. Sammy doesn't know his father stood in the snow for him. Don't you think he deserves to?" The diner was tucked away on a quiet street in Midtown, its neon sign flickering faintly in the winter dusk. Inside, the air smelled of coffee and fried onions, mingling with the low hum of conversation. Jason sat in a corner booth, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of black coffee. He hadn't touched it yet, too distracted by the weight of the moment, the fact that Elena had called him here, out of the blue, after days of silence. When she walked in, he spotted her immediately. She was dressed professionally, as always, a tailored coat draped over her shoulders, her hair pulled back into a sleek ponytail. Yet there was something softer about her today, less polished and more human. She slid into the seat across from him, setting her bag down beside her. "Thanks for coming," she said, her voice warm but measured. "I wasn't sure you'd show." Jason shrugged, avoiding her gaze. "You left me your card. Figured I owed you at least that much." Elena smiled faintly, though her eyes betrayed a flicker of nervousness. This wasn't going to be easy, for either of them. She took a deep breath, steeling herself before diving in. "I want to make you an offer," she began, leaning forward slightly. Her tone was earnest, almost urgent. "One that could change everything, not just for you, but for people like you. People who've been written off by the system." Jason frowned, suspicion creeping into his expression. "What kind of offer?" Elena hesitated, choosing her words carefully. "You have a story the world needs to hear. A perspective most people will never understand unless they live it themselves. I want you to come work with me, on my team. As a human values advisor." He blinked at her, clearly caught off guard. "A what?" "A human values advisor," she repeated, her confidence growing as she explained. "Your job would be to help shape company policies through lived empathy, to ensure we're not just making decisions based on spreadsheets, but on real human experiences. You'd advise leadership, consult on initiatives, maybe even speak publicly about your journey. We need someone like you, Jason. Someone who knows what it means to fight for dignity when the odds are stacked against you." For a long moment, he just stared at her, processing her words. Then, slowly, he shook his head, a rueful smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "You're serious? Me? In a suit and tie?" "You don't need the suit," Elena replied quickly, her voice firm. "Or the tie. Those things don't define you. But your words, they carry weight. They fit better than any tie ever could." Jason leaned back in the booth, his brow furrowed as he studied her. There was no mistaking the sincerity in her eyes, the conviction in her voice. And yet, how could he possibly step into a role like that? After years of scraping by, of being invisible to everyone except those who pitied him or looked down on him, how could he suddenly become someone whose opinion mattered? "I appreciate the offer," he said finally, his voice quieter now. "Really, I do. But I can't. Not yet." Elena's face fell, though she tried to mask her disappointment. "Why not?" "It's not about doubting myself," Jason admitted, his gaze dropping to the table. "It's Sammy. Until I figure out how to get back into his life, to prove to him that I'm still his dad, I can't focus on anything else. I won't." Understanding washed over Elena's features, softening her expression. She nodded slowly, respecting his decision even as her heart sank. "Okay," she said simply. "I get it. Family comes first. Always." There was a long pause, the kind that stretches between two people who respect each other deeply but are moving in different directions, for now. Finally, Elena reached into her bag and pulled out a small envelope, sliding it across the table toward him. "What's this?" Jason asked, picking it up cautiously. "It's a start," she replied, her lips curving into a faint smile. "An address. For supervised visitation. Richard agreed to arrange it. It's not perfect, but it's something." Jason froze, staring at the envelope as if it might vanish if he blinked. For the first time in years, hope flared inside him, not just for himself, but for Sammy. "Thank you," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Elena said gently, echoing his own words from their first meeting. "Just take care of yourself, and your son." As she stood to leave, Jason watched her go, the envelope clutched tightly in his hand. He didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, he felt like maybe, just maybe, he had a chance to rewrite it. The playground was alive with the sounds of children's laughter, their voices carrying on the crisp winter air like music. Jason stood at a distance, his hands shoved deep into the pockets of his jacket, Elena's jacket, as he watched Sammy run around with a group of kids. A chain-link fence separated them, but it might as well have been an ocean for how far away his son felt. This wasn't supposed to happen, not yet, anyway. According to CPS regulations, supervised visitations were strictly controlled and required weeks of paperwork and approvals. But Elena had pulled strings, convincing Richard to use his influence to arrange this private moment. It wasn't a meeting, it was a glimpse. Just enough for Jason to see that Sammy was happy, healthy, and thriving. And just enough for Jason to realize how much he'd missed. Sammy was bundled up in a bright blue coat, his cheeks flushed from the cold. He chased after a soccer ball, shouting gleefully as he kicked it toward another boy. When he stumbled, a tall man in a gray parka rushed over to help him up, ruffling his hair affectionately. "Careful there, buddy," the man said with a warm smile. "Mr. Josh." Sammy giggled, brushing snow off his gloves before darting back into the game. Jason flinched at the sound of that name, Mr. Josh Starr. Not Dad. Not Daddy. Just Mr. Josh. The foster dad. The man who got to tuck Sammy in at night, who read him bedtime stories, who taught him how to kick a soccer ball without falling flat on his face. The man who filled the void Jason had left behind. Tears stung Jason's eyes, blurring his vision. He clenched his fists inside his pockets, fighting back the wave of emotions threatening to overwhelm him. Guilt. Anger. Grief. Love. They all swirled together, choking him like a vice. He wanted to scream, to climb the fence, to scoop Sammy into his arms and never let go. But he couldn't. All he could do was stand there, invisible, watching the life his son had built without him. And then it hit him, the full weight of what he'd lost. Not just custody, not just a home or a job. He'd lost time. Years of memories, milestones, moments that could never be reclaimed. Birthdays. First days of school. Bedtime prayers whispered under the covers. Every second Sammy spent laughing with Mr. Josh was a second Jason would never get back. He sank onto a nearby bench, burying his face in his hands. His shoulders shook silently as tears streamed down his face. For so long, he'd told himself he was doing everything for Sammy. That every sacrifice, every hardship, was worth it if it meant proving he was still a good father. But now, sitting here alone while his son played happily yards away, he realized the truth: being a father wasn't about proving anything. It was about being there. About showing up, day after day, no matter how hard it got. When he finally looked up again, the sun was beginning to set, casting long shadows across the playground. Sammy was heading inside with the other kids, his tiny hand tucked securely in Mr. Josh's. Jason watched until they disappeared through the door, leaving him alone with the fading light. Hours later, back in the van, Jason sat staring at the envelope Elena had given him. Inside was the address for supervised visitation, a chance to reconnect with Sammy, however small. But more than that, it represented hope. A lifeline thrown to him when he thought he was drowning. His phone buzzed on the dashboard, startling him out of his thoughts. He picked it up hesitantly, seeing Elena's name flash across the screen. Taking a shaky breath, he answered. "Hello?" "Hey," Elena's voice came through, soft and steady. "How did it go?" Jason swallowed hard, gripping the phone tightly. "I saw him," he said, his voice cracking slightly. He's happy. Healthy. He calls his foster dad Mr. Josh." There was a pause on the other end of the line. Then, gently, Elena asked, "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking," Jason trailed off, closing his eyes as the words caught in his throat. Finally, he whispered, "Okay. I'll try. Whatever you need me to do, I'll try." Elena exhaled audibly, relief evident in her tone. "That's all I ask. One step at a time, Jason. You don't have to figure it all out right now." "I know," he murmured, glancing at the envelope again. "But, thank you for giving me this chance." "You earned it," Elena replied firmly. "Now go get some rest. Tomorrow's a new day." As he hung up, Jason leaned back against the seat, letting the enormity of his decision settle over him. Saying yes didn't mean the road ahead would be easy. If anything, it promised to be harder than anything he'd faced before. But for the first time in years, he felt like he was moving forward, not just surviving, but fighting for something worth living for. Outside, the city lights twinkled like stars, a reminder that even in the darkest nights, there was always a spark of hope waiting to guide you home. Jason's first week at Solaritech was surreal. Walking into the sleek, glass-walled headquarters felt like stepping onto another planet, a world far removed from the cold streets and cramped van he'd called home for so long. He wore a borrowed blazer that Elena had insisted on lending him. "It fits better than you think," she'd said with a wink, and though it wasn't exactly comfortable, it gave him a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. His official title, Human Values Advisor, was still strange to hear out loud. It sounded too formal, too polished for someone who just months ago had been sleeping behind warehouses. But as Elena explained during his orientation, his role wasn't about titles or appearances. It was about bringing humanity back into the corporate machine. About reminding people that policies affect real lives, and that kindness could be a competitive advantage. On his second day, Jason found himself standing in front of a room full of wide-eyed interns. They were fresh-faced college graduates, eager to climb the ladder but clearly intimidated by the high-stakes environment around them. Elena had asked him to share his story, not because it would inspire them, though she hoped it might, but because it would remind them why they were here, to make a difference, not just profits. "I won't lie to you," Jason began, pacing slowly across the front of the room. His voice was steady, though there was a raw honesty in his tone that silenced even the most skeptical listeners. "I haven't always been this guy." He gestured vaguely at his blazer, earning a few nervous chuckles. "A year ago, I didn't have a job, or a home, or much hope for either. I lost everything, my wife, my son, my career. And trust me, when you're living out of a van, wondering where your next meal is coming from, it feels like the world doesn't care." He paused, scanning the faces before him. Some looked curious, others uncomfortable, as if they weren't sure how to process what he was saying. But one young woman near the front nodded slowly, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. "The thing is," Jason continued, his voice softening, "it only takes one person to remind you that you matter. One act of kindness to pull you back from the edge. For me, it was a stranger who gave me a coat when I needed it most. That small gesture changed everything, for me, and eventually, for others." As he spoke, he noticed a young man in the back row shifting uncomfortably. When Jason finished his talk and opened the floor for questions, the intern hesitated before raising his hand. "Can I say something?" he asked quietly. "Of course," Jason replied, nodding encouragingly. The intern stood up, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the edge of his chair. "What you just described, it's my life. Right now. My family, we've been struggling since my dad got sick. I work 2 jobs just to keep us afloat while I'm interning here. Sometimes I feel like giving up, but hearing you talk about fighting through all that, it makes me think maybe I can do it too." The room fell silent, every eye turning toward the young man. Jason stepped closer, meeting his gaze with understanding. "You absolutely can," he said firmly. "And you don't have to do it alone. None of us do." By the end of the week, Jason had settled into a cozy office tucked away in a quiet corner of the building. It wasn't large, just big enough for a desk, a chair, and a small bookshelf, but it felt like a sanctuary. Elena had surprised him by decorating it herself, filling it with potted plants and framed quotes scribbled on colorful post-it notes. "Kindness is never wasted. Empathy fuels innovation. Be the light. Every detail was intentional, designed to reflect the values Jason was helping instill in the company. Slowly but surely, those values were starting to take root. Employees began leaving sticky notes of encouragement on each other's desks. Managers started hosting listening sessions, inviting team members to share their struggles without fear of judgment. Even the CEO made a point of acknowledging birthdays and personal milestones during meetings, a small gesture, but one that meant the world to those who received it. One afternoon, as Jason sat reviewing feedback from an initiative he'd helped launch, a program offering free mental health resources to employees, he overheard a conversation outside his door. 2 junior engineers were talking animatedly, their voices tinged with excitement. "Did you see the email about the new parental leave policy?" one asked. "They're doubling the paid time off for new parents." "I know," the other replied. "And get this, they're letting employees bring their kids to work twice a month if daycare falls through. Can you believe it?" Jason smiled to himself, leaning back in his chair. These changes weren't revolutionary, not compared to the sweeping innovations happening elsewhere in the tech industry. But they mattered. To the single mom juggling deadlines and diaper changes. To the young father working late nights while his partner battled illness. To everyone who needed to know they weren't invisible. For the first time in years, Jason felt like he belonged somewhere. Not because of the paycheck or the perks, but because he was making a difference, in ways both big and small. And as he glanced at the drawing of Sammy taped to the corner of his desk, he allowed himself a moment of quiet pride. He wasn't just rebuilding his own life anymore. He was helping others rebuild theirs too. The knock on the door sent Jason's heart racing. He stood frozen for a moment, staring at the peephole as if willing himself to stay calm. This was it, the moment he'd been working toward for years. The legal team Elena had assembled had done their job, navigating the labyrinth of paperwork, court hearings, and CPS evaluations. And now, finally, he had earned weekend visitation rights with Sammy. Taking a deep breath, Jason opened the door. There he was, his son, standing beside his foster mom, clutching a small backpack in one hand and a stuffed dinosaur in the other. Sammy looked up at him with wide eyes, unsure but curious. For a second, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, Sammy stepped forward, his gaze flickering between Jason and the cozy apartment behind him. "Hey, buddy," Jason said softly, crouching down to meet Sammy's eye level. "Ready to hang out?" Sammy nodded hesitantly, glancing back at his foster mom for reassurance. She smiled warmly, giving him an encouraging nod before turning to Jason. "He's all yours," she said kindly. "We'll see you Sunday evening." As she walked away, Jason reached out and gently took Sammy's hand. It felt strange yet achingly familiar, like holding something precious that had been missing for far too long. Leading Sammy inside, Jason gave him a quick tour of the modest one-bedroom apartment Elena had helped him rent. It wasn't much, a futon couch, a small kitchenette, and shelves lined with books, but it was clean and welcoming, filled with sunlight streaming through the blinds. "This is where I live now," Jason explained, gesturing around the room. "What do you think?" Sammy shrugged, still quiet but visibly relaxing as he explored. His eyes lit up when he spotted the TV and the stack of DVDs on the shelf. "Do you have any space movies?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Jason grinned, ruffling Sammy's hair affectionately. "You bet I do. How about we watch The Iron Giant? Remember how much you loved that one?" Sammy's face broke into a shy smile, and he nodded eagerly. Together, they settled onto the futon, blankets pulled tight around them as the opening credits rolled. The movie played in the background, its nostalgic soundtrack filling the room, but Jason couldn't focus on the screen. All he could see was Sammy, his son, curled up against him, trusting him again after so many years apart. At some point during the film, Sammy drifted off to sleep, his head resting lightly on Jason's chest. Jason froze, afraid to move, savoring the weight of his son's body against his own. Tears welled in his eyes as he brushed a strand of hair from Sammy's forehead, marveling at how small and fragile he seemed. Yet here he was, safe, sound, and finally within reach. Leaning down, Jason pressed a soft kiss to the top of Sammy's head. His voice was barely audible, trembling with emotion as he whispered, "I told you I'd come back." For a long moment, he simply sat there, cradling Sammy like he never wanted to let go. Outside, the city hummed with its usual chaos, but inside this little apartment, everything felt right. The past few years had been a blur of pain and perseverance, but tonight, none of that mattered. Tonight, Jason was exactly who he was meant to be, a father. And as he held his sleeping son close, he allowed himself to believe, not just hope, but truly believe, that maybe, just maybe, they could rebuild what they'd lost. One hug, one laugh, one memory at a time. Over the weeks, something shifted between Jason and Elena. It wasn't dramatic or loud, it was quiet, like the first rays of dawn breaking through a dark sky. Their relationship began with simple gestures, weekend coffee meetings to discuss his progress at Solaritech, late-night phone calls when he needed advice about Sammy, and shared laughter over takeout dinners in her penthouse kitchen. Slowly but surely, those moments started to feel less like professional exchanges and more like connection. One Friday evening, after a particularly long day at work, Elena invited Jason to stay for dinner instead of heading straight home. "Movie night," she suggested casually, as if it were no big deal. But there was a flicker of nervousness in her eyes, a vulnerability she rarely showed. Jason hesitated, glancing at his watch. "I should probably check on Sammy." "He's fine," Elena interrupted gently, already scrolling through streaming options on her TV. "Your sister-in-law texted me earlier, said he's having the time of his life building Lego spaceships with Mr. Josh. She smirked, adding teasingly, besides, even superheroes need a break sometimes. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. You're relentless, you know that. And yet here you are, she shot back with a grin, patting the couch beside her. Popcorn's almost ready. Pick something good. They ended up watching an old black and white classic, It's a Wonderful Life star. The film played in the background, its timeless themes of resilience and redemption resonating deeply with both of them. But neither paid much attention to the screen. Instead, they talked, really talked, for the first time since they'd met. You've come so far, Elena said quietly during a lull in the conversation. Her tone was thoughtful, almost reverent. I don't think I've ever met anyone who fights as hard as you do. Jason shrugged, staring into his coffee mug. I'm just trying to make things right, for Sammy, for myself. Doesn't always feel like enough. It is, she insisted firmly, turning to face him. You don't need to be fixed, Jason. You just needed space to grow. To find your footing again. Her words hit him like a wave, washing away some of the lingering guilt he carried. He looked at her then, not just as the woman who had given him a chance, but as someone who truly understood him. Someone who saw past the scars and struggles to the person underneath. What about you? He asked suddenly, surprising even himself. Who gave you space to grow? Elena froze, her expression softening as memories surfaced. For a moment, she didn't answer, her gaze drifting toward the city lights outside the window. Then, quietly, she began to speak. There was a man named Thomas, she said, her voice tinged with nostalgia. I was 8 years old, living on the streets after my foster parents kicked me out. One freezing night, this stranger walked up to me, handed me his coat, and told me I'd be okay. That single act of kindness saved me, not just from the cold, but from giving up entirely. Jason listened intently, captivated by the raw emotion in her voice. Did you ever see him again? She shook her head, smiling faintly. No. But I never forgot him. Every time I see someone struggling, I think about what he did for me, and how much it meant. There was a pause, heavy with unspoken understanding. Finally, Elena turned back to Jason, her eyes locking onto his. You remind me of him, she admitted softly. The way you gave away your jacket without hesitation, without expecting anything in return. It's rare. Beautiful. Jason blinked, caught off guard by her words. I'm not sure I deserve that comparison, he murmured, looking down at his hands. Yes, you do, she replied firmly, reaching over to place a hand on his arm. You've spent your whole life fighting for others, even when it cost you everything. Don't underestimate the power of that, Jason. People like you, we need more of you in this world. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of her confession hung in the air, binding them together in a way neither could fully articulate. Outside, the city buzzed with its usual energy, oblivious to the quiet transformation happening within these walls. As the credits rolled on the movie, Jason glanced at Elena, his heart swelling with gratitude, and something else he couldn't quite name. Thank you, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. For believing in me. For reminding me that I'm worth saving. You already knew that, she replied with a small smile. I just helped you remember. And in that moment, surrounded by the warmth of friendship and the promise of new beginnings, Jason realized something profound. Love doesn't have to be loud or grandiose to change your life. Sometimes, it grows quietly, like a seed planted in fertile soil, nurtured by patience, trust, and unwavering support. The grand ballroom of the Solaritech Gala was alive with energy. Crystal chandeliers cast shimmering light across tables adorned with white linens and elegant centerpieces. Guests mingled beneath the high ceilings, their laughter blending with the soft hum of classical music played by a string quartet. Jason stood near the back of the room, feeling slightly out of place in his tailored suit despite Elena's assurance that he looked perfect. He watched as she took the stage, her presence commanding yet warm. Dressed in a sleek emerald gown that complemented her dark hair, Elena exuded confidence, but there was something else in her eyes tonight, a quiet vulnerability that hinted at what was to come. As the crowd settled into silence, she began to speak. "Tonight," she said, her voice steady but filled with emotion, "I want to share a story. A story about kindness, resilience, and the extraordinary power of one small act to change everything." She paused, letting her words sink in before continuing. "Months ago, I found myself standing at a bus stop on one of the coldest nights of the year. I didn't know it then, but that night would alter the course of my life, and the lives of many others. A man approached me, a stranger, and handed me his jacket without asking for anything in return. That jacket wasn't just fabric, it carried a piece of his soul, a reminder that humanity still exists even in our darkest moments." Elena turned toward Jason, who shifted uncomfortably under the weight of her gaze. "That man is here with us tonight. His name is Jason Carter. And though he may not realize it, he has taught all of us something invaluable, that true strength lies not in what we keep, but in what we give." The audience erupted into applause, their cheers echoing through the ballroom. Jason felt heat rise to his cheeks as Elena gestured for him to join her on stage. He hesitated, unsure if he should move, but when she smiled encouragingly, he stepped forward, crossing the room amidst whistles and clapping. When he reached the stage, Elena extended her hand, pulling him closer to the microphone. "Jason," she said softly, her voice trembling slightly, "you've already given so much, to your son, to this company, to me. But tonight," she trailed off, stepping aside to give him space. Jason swallowed hard, his heart pounding like a drum. This was it, the moment he'd been rehearsing in his mind for weeks. Reaching into the pocket of the same olive jacket he'd once given away, he pulled out a small velvet box. The room fell silent, anticipation crackling in the air. Kneeling down on one knee, Jason opened the box to reveal a simple yet beautiful diamond ring. Looking up at Elena, he spoke from the depths of his heart. "Elena," he began, his voice thick with emotion, "you saved me, not because you had to, but because you believed in me when no one else did. You reminded me that love doesn't have to be loud to be real. It can grow quietly, patiently, like ours has. Will you spend the rest of your life reminding me every day how lucky I am?" Tears streamed down Elena's face as she stared at him, her hands pressed to her mouth. For a moment, she couldn't speak, overwhelmed by the enormity of the moment. Then, finally, she nodded, her voice breaking as she whispered, "Yes. Absolutely yes." The room exploded into cheers and applause, guests rising to their feet as Jason stood and slipped the ring onto Elena's finger. Pulling her into his arms, he kissed her deeply, sealing a promise that had been years in the making. Around them, the world seemed to fade, the glittering lights, the music, the crowd, all melting away until it was just the two of them, holding on to each other as if nothing else mattered. As they embraced, Elena rested her head against his chest, listening to the steady rhythm of his heartbeat. In that moment, she realized something profound: the journey they'd taken separately had led them here, together. Two broken souls, bound by acts of kindness and love, ready to face whatever lay ahead side by side. And as the clock struck midnight, marking the end of the gala, neither could deny the truth: this wasn't just the beginning of a new chapter, it was the start of a lifetime. The wedding was held on a crisp autumn afternoon, the golden sunlight filtering through the large windows of Thomas's Place, a non-profit community center dedicated to helping foster children and families in need. Named after the man who had once saved Elena's life with his coat, the venue felt like the perfect setting for a day that celebrated love, resilience, and second chances. Guests filled the cozy space, their laughter and chatter creating an atmosphere of warmth and belonging. Among them were co-workers from Solara Tech, former shelter friends Jason had stayed connected with, and even a few foster kids Elena had mentored over the years. Sammy sat proudly in the front row, wearing a miniature suit that matched Jason's, clutching a stuffed dinosaur as if it were part of the ceremony itself. At the center of it all stood the altar, framed by garlands of white flowers and twinkling fairy lights. But the most striking feature wasn't floral arrangements or candles, it was the old olive jacket, carefully mounted behind glass and displayed like a cherished artifact. Beneath it hung a small plaque inscribed with simple yet powerful words, *1 small act. As the music began, Jason took his place at the altar, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the lapel of his suit. He glanced toward the entrance, where Elena stood with her assistant Rachel, who was helping adjust the train of her gown. When she finally appeared, walking down the aisle escorted by Richard, her surrogate father figure for the day, Jason's breath caught in his throat. She looked radiant, her smile lighting up the room more than any chandelier ever could. When they reached the altar, Richard kissed Elena's cheek before stepping back, leaving her hand in Jason's. As they faced each other, surrounded by the people who mattered most, neither could believe how far they'd come, from strangers at a bus stop to partners standing on the brink of forever. The officiant began the ceremony, his voice steady and warm. "We gather here today not just to witness the union of two remarkable individuals, but to celebrate the power of kindness, the kind of kindness that changes lives, restores hope, and creates futures." He paused, gesturing toward the framed jacket behind them. "This coat symbolizes more than fabric and thread. It represents the ripple effect of one small act, a gesture so simple, yet so profound, that brought us all together today. Let it remind us that compassion is never wasted, and that every choice we make has the potential to shape someone's world." Elena squeezed Jason's hand, tears glistening in her eyes as she whispered, "I can't believe this is real." "It's real," Jason replied softly, his own voice thick with emotion. "And it's ours." After exchanging vows that left not a single dry eye in the room, they sealed their promise with a kiss, prompting cheers and applause from the guests. As confetti rained down and everyone moved outside for the reception, Jason lingered near the framed jacket, running his fingers lightly over the glass. "You kept it," he said quietly, turning to Elena. "Of course I did," she replied, smiling. "It's a piece of our story. A reminder of where we started, and how far we've come." Later that evening, as the celebration wound down and the stars began to twinkle overhead, Jason stood beneath a string of lanterns, watching Elena dance with Sammy. The boy laughed freely, spinning her around until she collapsed into giggles. It was a scene straight out of a dream, one Jason never thought he'd live to see. Closing his eyes, he reflected on everything that had led them here. The cold nights in the van. The kindness of strangers. The courage to keep fighting, even when the odds seemed insurmountable. And now, this, a family, a future, a love that had grown quietly but surely, like roots sinking deep into fertile soil. A gentle breeze carried the sound of distant laughter, mingling with the soft rustle of leaves. In that moment, Jason heard a voice, not spoken aloud, but echoing in his heart, a closing narration that tied the threads of their journey together. *1 small act can ripple further than we'll ever know. A coat given without hesitation. A moment shared between strangers. A future built on trust and love. Never underestimate kindness, for it has the power to heal wounds, rebuild lives, and connect souls across time and circumstance. Opening his eyes, Jason smiled as Elena approached, wrapping her arms around him. Together, they looked up at the stars, knowing that whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them side by side. Because they had already proven that even in the darkest nights, light could be found, and that sometimes, all it takes is one small act to change everything. The lesson: kindness creates ripples. This story reminds us that life's greatest moments often begin with the smallest gestures. A coat handed to a stranger. A second chance offered when it seemed impossible. A quiet act of compassion in a world that often feels cold and indifferent. These moments may seem insignificant at first, but they have the power to ripple outward, touching lives in ways we could never predict. Jason and Elena's journey teaches us that kindness isn't just about grand gestures or sweeping sacrifices, it's about showing up, even when it's hard. It's about believing in someone when they've stopped believing in themselves. And most importantly, it's about understanding that every person we meet is fighting battles we can't see. When we choose to extend a hand, offer a listening ear, or simply give what little we have, we plant seeds of hope that can grow into something extraordinary. So, the next time you find yourself hesitating, wondering if your actions really matter, remember this: one small act can change everything. You never know who might need it, or how far the ripples of your kindness will travel. Don't miss out on more stories like this. If this story resonated with you, make sure to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next unforgettable tale. We're here to bring you stories that inspire, challenge, and remind you of the beauty in humanity. Hit the notification bell to stay updated, and join us as we continue exploring the moments that define us. Because everyone has a story worth telling, and yours might be next.